It began in the middle of the night. A man sat alone in a cave carved into the side of a Himalayan cliff. No phone, no sound, just the wind howling like a voice from another world. He hadn't spoken in days. He hadn't eaten in hours. And yet, something was waking up inside him. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a memory. It was something deeper. A realization not about the world, but about himself. That everything he had believed about who he was, his story, his name, his status, his goals, was a mask, a well-crafted illusion. And in that moment, something shattered. But not outside, but within. That man could be me, and that man could be you. Because this is what Jung meant when he said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. This is what no one tells you about Carl Jung's ego theory. Once you really understand it, your sense of self will never be the same. And you'll begin to wonder, am I actually living my truth, or am I just performing a lie I've mistaken for a life?
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
We all know the word ego. We throw it around like it's simple. He has a big ego. Let your ego go. That's just your ego talking. But Jung saw the ego not as a villain but as a necessary illusion, a functional lie. It's the center of consciousness. The I that wakes up each morning and says, "This is me." It's how we navigate the world, make decisions, build identities. But here's the radical part. The ego is not the whole of you. It's a fragment, a surface, a reflection in the mirror, not the face behind it. And the tragedy is that most of us spend our entire lives confusing this reflection for the real thing. We defend it. We polish it. We justify it. We build entire empires around it. And yet deep down, there's a whisper, a knowing, that it's not the full story, that something inside us has been buried, muted, caged. And this is where the lie begins, because the ego, by its nature, is selective. It builds itself out of what's acceptable, what's praised, what's safe. From childhood, we are given subtle messages: be this, not that. Speak this way. Think like this. Don't feel too much. Don't question too deeply. And the ego adapts. It becomes the mask that fits the culture, the family, the moment. But what happens to the parts of us that don't fit? The wild parts, the emotional parts, the visionary, intuitive, rebellious, erotic, chaotic parts. They don't die. They go underground, into what Jung called the shadow. Now imagine this. You're living a life based on your ego, your constructed identity, but the shadow grows behind you. It leaks through your behavior, your dreams, your relationships. It shows up in projection when you hate in others what you deny in yourself. It shows up in anxiety when your inner world rebels against your outer life. It shows up in addiction, sabotage, obsession, even illness. And here's the terrifying truth. The more tightly you cling to your ego, the more violently the shadow fights for its return. Because the psyche seeks wholeness, and wholeness requires integration, not perfection. Integration means facing the parts of yourself you've disowned. The parts you've labeled bad, wrong, too much, not enough. This is the beginning of what Jung called the individuation process, the path back to the self. And it begins with the question, what if everything I believed about myself is only half the truth? Let's go deeper. The ego for Jung wasn't evil. It was necessary. You need an ego to function, to drive, to discern. But problems arise when the ego thinks it's the king, when it forgets it's only the steward. The ego is like a flashlight in a vast cave. It can illuminate a little, but it can't see the whole. And if you mistake the beam for the totality, you'll live in a prison of your own making. This is why people break down in midlife, in crisis, in transition. The structures built by the ego no longer hold. The job, the role, the name, they collapse. And underneath, something older begins to stir. Jung called this the encounter with the self, not the social self, not the personality, but the archetypal center of your being, the part of you that existed before language, and before conditioning, before fear. But accessing the self requires ego death, not literal death, but symbolic, a letting go of false certainty, a descent into the unknown. This is the part no one tells you. It's not pretty. It's not Instagrammable. It's terrifying. It feels like losing your mind. Because the ego is your mind, and now you're stepping beyond it. That's why Jung said, enlightenment doesn't come from imagining figures of light, but from making the darkness conscious. The darkness is everything the ego refuses to see. And yet, it holds the key to your freedom, because within the shadow is not just pain, but power, creativity, vitality. The parts of you that can feel fully, love deeply, risk boldly. So, how do we begin this journey? How do we move from egoic illusion to integrated truth? It starts with radical honesty. You stop lying to yourself. You stop pretending. You stop performing. You ask yourself brutal questions. Who am I when no one's watching? What am I afraid people will find out? What parts of me have I buried just to be accepted? And then you go deeper. You track your projections. You notice who triggers you and why. You watch your dreams. You pay attention to synchronicities. The psyche is always speaking through symbols, through symptoms, through slips. But we must listen, not with analysis, but with presence. And then the work begins. Real shadow integration is not about talking, it's about feeling. You let the rage come up, the grief and the shame, the desire. You let it burn through you without collapsing into it. You hold it with awareness. You dialogue with it. You give it a voice. This is where active imagination becomes powerful, not as fantasy, but as soul work. You meet the parts of yourself you've exiled. You invite them home, and something incredible happens. The ego begins to loosen. It's no longer the tyrant. It becomes a servant, a bridge between your inner world and outer life. And you begin to feel real, not perfect, not polished, but whole. I want to ask you something that might shake your foundation. Who are you beneath your name, your job, your gender, your history? Who is there when the story falls away? And do you have the courage to meet that self not as an idea, but as a living reality? Because that's what this is about. Not theory, not philosophy, but transformation. The ego will resist. It will distract. It will defend. But deeper than the ego is the self, and the self is calling you home. Through your longing, through your suffering, and through every moment that feels hollow or off or fake. That's the call, and you can't ignore it forever. You see, most people think waking up means feeling good. But real awakening is deeper. It means becoming conscious of what was unconscious. But it means seeing your life clearly for the first time. And that clarity can be painful. But it's also liberating, because now you have a choice. You can keep living the lie, or you can begin the work of becoming real. And when you begin that work, you'll find that the world changes. Not because it's different, but because you are. You see people more clearly. You feel more deeply. You create from a place of truth. Your relationships become mirrors, not masks. And your struggles become initiations, not punishments. You stop asking, "How do I succeed?" and start asking, "How do I serve what's real in me?" And that's the moment the ego surrenders, not in defeat, but in reverence, because it realizes it was never meant to be the master. It was meant to be the vessel. And maybe, just maybe, you'll look in the mirror one morning and see not a mask, but a mystery. Not an identity, but a being. Not a lie, but a life. The moment you begin to see not a mask, but a mystery in the mirror, everything changes. You no longer move through life seeking validation, you begin seeking truth. You stop chasing applause and start listening for resonance. And most importantly, you stop asking, "What do they think of me?" and start asking, "What does my soul think of me?" And that shift is seismic, because now your compass is no longer external, it's internal. The ego, once obsessed with survival and status, begins to bow to something deeper, the self. And the self doesn't care about your resume. It doesn't care how many followers you have, how many awards you've won, or how well you play the game. The self cares about one thing: are you living in alignment with your inner truth? Are you integrated? Are you whole? But this is where things get uncomfortable. Because when we begin to live from the self instead of the ego, we will lose things: approval, familiarity, even relationships. The false life, the one built on performance, begins to fall apart. Why? Because it has to. The old identity cannot hold the weight of the new awareness. Jung said, "You meet your destiny on the road you take to avoid it." What you avoid, your fears, your doubts, your shadow, is exactly what holds the key to your liberation. And so, when the ego begins to dissolve, we find ourselves in what feels like a void, an emptiness. The old self is gone, but the new self hasn't fully arrived. This is the liminal space, the in-between, a kind of inner wilderness, and most people run from it. They rush to rebuild the ego, to find a new identity, a new role, a new mask. But if we can stay in that space long enough to listen, something extraordinary happens. The self begins to emerge, not as a concept, but as a presence. You feel it in your body, in your dreams, or in the way you speak. It's not loud, it's not flashy, but it's real. And once you feel that, you realize, I've been living in exile from myself, and now I'm coming home. Now, let's get very practical. You might be wondering, how do I know if I'm living from ego or from self? The symptoms are subtle but clear. When you're in ego, you feel tight, defensive, like you're constantly proving something. There's anxiety beneath the surface because the ego knows it's fragile. So it clings, it manipulates, it fears failure like death. But when you're in self, there's spaciousness. You don't need to prove. You don't need to dominate. You can feel your emotions without being consumed by them. You can hold paradox. You can admit when you're wrong. You can say, I don't know, and feel no shame. Because the self isn't interested in performance, it's interested in presence. But That's why we need practices, not just ideas. Philosophy is beautiful, but without embodiment, it becomes another ego game. So here are some practices that help dissolve the ego and awaken the self. First, radical self-inquiry. Ask yourself every day, what am I pretending not to know? That question cuts through illusion like a blade. Second, shadow work. Every time someone triggers you, ask, what part of myself am I projecting onto them? Third, conscious solitude. Spend time with no input. No phone, no music, no distraction. Just you and your inner world. Let the silence speak. Or fourth, symbolic awareness. Pay attention to dreams, synchronicities, strange emotions. The unconscious is always speaking in symbols. Learn its language. Fifth, creative expression. Not to impress, but to express. Paint, write, dance, scream. Let the hidden parts of you speak through form. And don't expect this to be easy. The ego will resist. It will rationalize. It will say, this is pointless. This is weird. This is dangerous. That's because the ego survives through control. But the self only arrives when you surrender. And that surrender is not weakness, it's wisdom. It's the moment you stop fighting reality and start flowing with it. You realize that life isn't something happening to you, it's something happening through you. And when you align with that flow, you don't lose yourself, you find your real self. But we have to talk about the dark night, because every true transformation passes through it. In the moment when everything collapses, when the identity you've clung to dissolves, when nothing makes sense, when you feel lost, alone, broken. Jung knew this space intimately. He wrote, "In all chaos there is a cosmos, in all disorder a secret order." The dark night isn't the end, it's the threshold. It's the death of the false self. And if you can endure it, not avoid it, not numb it, but endure it, you will emerge with something you never had before: depth. Depth is the gift of ego death. You feel more. You see more. You love more. Not because life got easier, but because you got realer. You stopped living someone else's script. You started writing your own. And that script is not about being perfect. It's about being whole, fully human, fully alive. But let me ask you something that might seem simple, but is actually terrifying if you answer it honestly. Who would you be if you stopped performing? If you stopped trying to be liked, respected, admired? If you let the masks fall, would you recognize yourself? Would others? And are you willing to let the person you've pretended to be die, so the person you actually are can be born? This is what no one tells you about Jung's ego theory. It's not just an idea, it's an invitation. But to wake up, to stop living a lie, to stop mistaking your identity for your essence, and to begin the messy, beautiful, terrifying journey back to yourself. And when you begin living from that self, you'll notice something strange. You become calmer but more powerful, softer but more grounded. You speak less but say more. But you might lose followers, but gain depth. You might lose comfort, but gain freedom. Because you're no longer being driven by fear, you're being pulled by truth. And here's the final paradox. The ego will never fully die. It's part of you, but it no longer needs to dominate. It becomes integrated. It becomes a tool, not a tyrant. And that's the real goal. Not to destroy the ego, but to decenter it, and to put it in its rightful place, as a servant to the self. So what does this mean for your life right now? It means you have a choice. You can keep playing the game, you keep reinforcing the mask, keep living from fear and call it success. Or you can pause, look inward, and ask, what part of me have I abandoned in order to survive? Because that part is still there, still waiting, still alive. And when you return to it, when you welcome it back, when you say, I see you, I remember you, I'm sorry I left, something sacred happens. You begin to feel whole again. And that, more than anything, is the point. You don't need to become someone new. You need to remember who you were before the world taught you to forget. Once you remember who you were before the world taught you to forget, you begin to feel the weight of your own existence differently. Not heavier, not more burdensome, but more real. You no longer walk through life like a ghost trying to fulfill a script written by someone else. You begin to sense that your choices have gravity, that your presence matters, not because of how others perceive you, but because you are finally living from your center. And at that center, something ancient and alive begins to stir. Jung called it the self, but you might call it soul, essence, truth, or simply the part of you that feels like home. The self is not an idea, it is a lived experience. It is the quiet knowing that emerges when the noise of the ego fades. But this knowing is not passive. It's not about sitting in peace and light forever. It's about participation, about living with integrity, with courage, with depth. It's about facing the reality of your shadow and choosing not to collapse but to integrate. You become the alchemist of your own psyche, turning the lead of unconscious compulsion into the gold of conscious choice. And that's where the paradox of the ego becomes clear. The ego is both the problem and part of the solution. Without a strong ego, you cannot do the work. You cannot hold the tension of opposites. You cannot stand in the fire of your own transformation. But with an inflated ego, you build a fortress that keeps the self out. You become rigid, defended, obsessed with being right, with being seen in a certain way, with being in control. And so, the true task is not to destroy the ego, but to reorient it, to put it in right relationship with the self. This is what Jung meant by individuation, the process of becoming whole, not by inflating the ego, but by integrating it into a larger, more fluid, more symbolic field of being. And this process is not linear. It doesn't happen once and for all. It unfolds in cycles, in spirals, in seasons. Sometimes you feel clear, other times confused. Sometimes you feel powerful, other times broken. But through it all, a deeper thread runs, a thread of becoming, of remembering, of returning. So what does this look like in real life? It looks like waking up one day and realizing that your career, your relationships, your goals, all the things you thought defined you are no longer satisfying. Not because they are bad, but because they were built on an outdated version of you. And instead of pushing forward, you pause. You listen. You ask, what is trying to die in me and what is trying to be born? It looks like having the courage to admit that the life you built was built from fear, from approval seeking, from unconscious wounds, and then choosing to dismantle it piece by piece with love, not shame. It looks like sitting with your jealousy, your rage, your guilt, not to indulge it or suppress it, but to understand it. To ask it, what do you want me to know? It looks like facing your loneliness and realizing that what you're truly craving is not another person, but a reunion with your own soul. And slowly, something shifts. You begin to trust your intuition more than your conditioning. You begin to say no to things that once defined your worth. You begin to say yes to the things that scare you because they feel so true. You begin to notice that your dreams are more vivid, that your emotions are more nuanced, that your creativity flows not from effort, but from alignment. You begin to feel less like a character and more like an author. You stop asking, "What should I do?" and start asking, "What wants to move through me?" And that's when life starts to feel mythic, not in the sense of grandiosity, but in the sense of meaning. Every moment becomes a symbol. Every conflict becomes a mirror. Every choice becomes a ritual. You realize you're not just living a life, you're participating in a story far older than your name, a story that began long before you and will continue long after. But this awareness comes with responsibility. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't go back to pretending that the ego is all there is. You now know the cost of inauthenticity. You've tasted the freedom of truth. And so you begin to shape your life differently. You surround yourself with people who see you deeply, not just those who validate your persona. You pursue work that expresses your essence, not just your skills. You make time for silence, for reflection, for the inner world. You treat your triggers as teachers, not enemies. You begin to lead, love, and live from a place of soul, and that radiates. People feel it. Not because you're trying to impress them, but because something in you is aligned, and alignment is magnetic. You become a lighthouse not by shining for others, but by refusing to dim your own light. And still, the ego whispers. It tells you you're not enough. It pulls you back into comparison, into fear, into performance. And when that happens, you don't fight it, you meet it. You say, "I see you. I know you're afraid, but I am no longer led by fear." You begin to develop a relationship with your ego, not as a tyrant, but as a child wounded, scared, brilliant in its own way, but in need of guidance. The self becomes the parent, the witness, the deeper intelligence that can hold all of you without judgment. And that's when the integration happens. When the ego stops pretending to be the whole and starts serving the whole. When the mask becomes transparent and the truth shines through. In this space, even your past transforms. What once felt like failure becomes initiation. What once felt like trauma becomes a doorway. You stop wishing things had been different. You start asking, what did this teach me about who I really am? You reclaim the parts of you that were lost in adaptation. You rewrite your story, not by erasing the pain, but by giving it meaning. You begin to live in dialogue with your own life, not dictating it, not escaping it, but listening to it, responding to it, dancing with it. This is not a one-time revelation. It is a lifelong devotion, a practice of remembering over and over who you are beneath the ego. And that remembering changes how you show up everywhere. In love, you are no longer needy, you are present. In work, you are no longer proving, you are offering. In conflict, you are no longer defensive, you are curious. In solitude, you are no longer empty, you are full. This is the fruit of ego integration. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of meaning. Not perfection, but wholeness. Not certainty, but trust. And so I'll leave you with one final question, not to answer right now, but to carry with you into the quiet moments, the dark nights, the sudden awakenings. That question is this: if you stopped performing, stopped pretending, stopped protecting, who would you become? Not as an ideal, not as a fantasy, but as a lived, breathing, embodied truth. Because that version of you is already here, beneath the noise, beneath the conditioning, beneath the lie, and now you have a choice. You keep serving the mask, or start serving the mystery, because that mystery, it's you, and it's waiting.